A lot of people believe that prior to the 17th Amendment, which changed how senators were chosen for Congress from state legislatures choosing them to the people at large in each state, but a lot of people believe that there was an additional power in state legislatures to also recall and replace senators either for bad behavior or at will. But what if I told you that this was just a myth? Well, because it was. And on this episode, I've got all the receipts from the ratification debates to show that this power never existed under the Constitution. It actually was a power under the Articles of Confederation. I'll also explain some of the Federalist views as to why they opposed it and the Anti-Federalist views as to why they were in favor of it. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, August 23rd, 2024. Now, talking about a recall power for the states, for people in Congress, we have to start out with the Articles of Confederation, Article 5. For the more convenient management of the general interests of the United States, delegates shall be annually appointed in such manner as the legislature of each state shall direct, to meet in Congress on the first Monday in November in every year, with a power reserved to each state to recall its delegates, or any of them, at any time within the year, and to send others in their stead for the remainder of the year. So there absolutely was a recall power under the Articles of Confederation. And in the first drafts of what they were considering for the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787, well, getting into the summer, was the Virginia Plan. And there was originally a proposal to have some recall power there. But here on June 12th, we see that on the question moved by Mr. Pinckney for striking out, quote, incapable of re-election into the first branch of the national legislature for years, and subject to recall. So this is a motion to strike out some text that said that the people going to Congress could be subject to recall. It was agreed to unanimously to get rid of it. Now, Edmund Randolph, who presented originally that Virginia plan starting, I think it was May 29, 1787, here he is a few days later, June 16th, discussing Congress under the Articles versus what they were trying to do for the Constitution for the United States. And here's how he put it. Congress are, moreover, not elected by the people, but by the legislatures who retain even a power of recall. They have, therefore, no will of their own. They are a mere diplomatic body and are always obsequious to the views of the states, obsequious is obedient, who are always encroaching on the authority of the United States. So those who wanted a different type of a system, rather than a confederation of states with states sending representatives, delegates, ambassadors, and etc., and states retaining the ultimate authority over them, they were looking for a more energetic system. Some wanted a totally nationalized system. And in that kind of a system, the senators had to have the power to be national representatives. And the idea that they could be recalled was something that these people were vehemently opposed to. Now, the idea of a recall never really even came up again for another 2 months when Elbridge Gerry brought it up on August 14th, 1787, but he was there complaining that a recall power didn't exist. He thought it was a problem. And so here he is talking about what they had put together by that point. As it now stands, it is as complete an aristocracy as ever was framed. If great power should be given to the Senate, we shall be governed in reality by a junto as has been apprehended. So he's warning about the structure of the Senate, just like many of the Anti-Federalists did later on. And some of the things that he complained about, he said, well, they're chosen for 6 years. Those of Congress, that is of the Confederation Congress, annually. They are not subject to recall. Those of Congress are. So he didn't like what they were doing, but there weren't many others who were on board with adding a recall power. So no such provisions were included from the Philadelphia Convention in the final version sent, first of all, to the Confederation Congress and then on to the states for ratification consideration. So when they were voting on ratification, no one was actually choosing whether to approve or deny the power to recall. It just didn't even exist. That doesn't mean that there was no debate about it. And we did see some debate on this in places like Massachusetts, especially in New York and elsewhere. But here are some of the Federalist arguments against a recall power, very similar to what Edmund Randolph had to say in Philadelphia. Here's Alexander Hamilton in the New York Ratifying Convention. He said, "I insist that in whatever body the power of recall is vested, the senator will perpetually feel himself in such a state of vassalage and dependence that he can never possess that firmness which is necessary to the discharge of his great duty to the Union." Now, some of you might be thinking, don't threaten me with a good time, Alex Hamilton, because I prefer the idea of senators merely representing the states. But this is not what they were going for, the Federalists. They wanted kind of a different system. Here's Theophilus Parsons discussing this further. In the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, he said, talking about how things are currently under the Articles, or at least for them at that time, all the checks the states have is a power to remove and disgrace an unfaithful servant after the mischief is perpetrated. He's arguing like, look, we're trying to come up with better checks and balances just beyond. He's making the case that if all you can do is just get rid of them, that isn't a good enough check and balance for this kind of a system. He said no essential benefit could be derived to the people from these provisions, but great inconveniences will result from them. And he continued saying, but what is the effect of the power of recalling? Your representative, with an operating revocation over his head, will lose all ideas of the general good and will dwindle to a servile agent, attempting to serve local and partial benefits by cabal and intrigue. Now, one more from Hamilton here in the New York Ratifying Convention, just as a quick summary. He said, but if they can be recalled at any moment, they will be so dependent that they will yield to it and not have firmness for national purposes. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have Patrick Henry, who certainly liked the power of recall, thought it was essential. He said, at present, you may appeal to the voice of the people and send men to Congress positively instructed to obey your direction. This is the idea of states being more independent, sovereign, free and independent states like we saw under the Declaration of Independence, and supporting those principles from the American Revolution. And if they're going to have delegates, then the state is more prime in that system. So at present, you can appeal to the voice of the people, send men to Congress positively instructed to obey your direction. You can recall them if their system of policy be ruinous. And Patrick Henry then just went on to compare it with the proposed Constitution. This is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said, but can you in this government recall your senators? Or can you instruct them? You cannot recall them. You may instruct them and offer your opinions, but if they think them improper, they may disregard them. So Patrick Henry is really hammering home the idea that these senators are going to be totally independent of the power of the states. Now, for Federalists, that was a great idea. For Anti-Federalists, they saw it as a terrible idea. Federal Farmer discussed this as well. He said, this new plan is a totally different thing. A national government. As I mentioned before, those who wanted a national government, if you want a nationalized system, then you can't have states having so much say over how it played out. This new plan is totally different. A national government to many purposes administered by men chosen for 2, 4, and 6 years, not recallable, and among whom there will be no rotation. Luther Martin had one of the most forceful arguments against the fact that there was no recall power under the Constitution. He said they are not liable to be recalled during the period for which they are chosen. This is him writing in Genuine Information number 4. He said, thus, sir, the result would be this. For 6 years, the senators are rendered totally and absolutely independent of their states, of whom they ought to be the representatives, without any bond or tie between them. He added a lot of italics and emphasis on this, especially like independent of their states and representatives. If they're representing the states and they are the agent of the states, the notion was, well, an agent can be changed out at will. They are not locked in. Going further, this is how Martin put it. During that time, they may join in measures ruinous and destructive to their states, even such as should totally annihilate their state governments. And their states cannot recall them, nor exercise any control over them. Dr. Taylor in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention also hit on this. By the Articles of Confederation, annual elections are provided for, though we also have additional securities in a right to recall any or all of our members from Congress and a provision for rotation. In the proposed Constitution, there is no provision for rotation, and we have no right by it to recall our delegates. So I'm not sure where this notion that, and we hear this all the time, anytime we talk about the 17th Amendment in a podcast or a video, or we have articles or emails about it, we get a pretty significant number of people commenting or emailing to tell us, oh, and the other thing that's missing is, well, before the 17th Amendment, states could just recall. And this is just false. Now, certainly it's correct for under the Articles of Confederation, but it wasn't really used. I think there may have been one instance it was ever used, but the argument was, well, the fact that it was there kept people more in check. Now, here's Colonel William Jones, also in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said his objections still remained that senators are chosen for so long a time will forget their duty to their constituents. We cannot recall them. The choice of representatives was too long. The Senate was much worse. It is, said he, a bad precedent and is unconstitutional. And I believe he followed up. It was either Jones or Taylor followed up saying that without a recall power, once they are chosen, the expectation was that they are chosen forever. Their expectation and their prediction was without a recall power, they were just going to stay in office for life. We've got many examples of how that has played out as well. Major Martin Kingsley, also in Massachusetts, said by the Articles of Confederation, the people have 3 checks on their delegates in Congress: the annual election of them, their rotation, and the power to recall any or all of them when they see fit. In the new Constitution, said Kingsley, we are deprived of annual elections, have no rotation, and cannot recall our members. Therefore, our federal rulers will be masters and not servants. I think that's an important distinction, and it's very interesting to look at it that way as well, because if they are your servant, then you can tell your servant what to do whenever the heck you want, for any reason. If they're your master, maybe it's a little bit different. Now, here in New York, well, not here in New York, but in the New York Ratifying Convention, there were some proposals to include a recommended amendment for this, and there was some debate over it. It was first presented by Gilbert Livingston on June 24th. Now, all this stuff, all these original source documents that I'm discussing here, they will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm very grateful for all the awesome work that Alan does to get that organized, but there will be a show link section so you can say, hey, where's that link? Or where can I see Gilbert Livingston introducing this resolution in New York to have a recall power appended to the Constitution? Well, that'll be there for sure. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Here's how Livingston put it. I think, sir, we must relinquish the idea of safety under this government. If the time for services is not further limited, and the power of recall given to the state legislatures. So he's saying, we cannot secure our freedom. We cannot ensure that government will stay within the bounds of the Constitution if we don't have these things, and heavily leaning on the recall power. So we introduce this resolution. Resolved that no person shall be eligible as a senator for more than 6 years in any term of 12 years. And that it shall be in the power of the legislatures of the several states to recall their senators, or either of them, and to elect others in their stead to serve for the remainder of the time for which such senator or senators so recalled were appointed. Now, this hits some pretty harsh opposition. You heard a little bit from Alexander Hamilton. There's also the Chancellor, Robert Livingston, who said the state legislatures, he's arguing that you're going to end up with a government of factions. Now, I think maybe either way you ended up with a government of factions, and maybe that's just the nature of things. But Livingston put it like this. The state legislatures, being frequently subject to factious and irregular passions, may be unjustly disaffected and discontented with their delegates. And a senator may be appointed one day and recalled the next. I can think of a few that should have that happened to them, maybe all of them. This would be a source of endless confusion, said Livingston. The Senate are indeed designed to represent the state governments, but, and here's the key, they are also the representatives of the United States and are not to consult the interest of any one state alone, but that of the Union. So whether we agree with that type of perspective or not, we can see that on the Federalist side, the reason that they're rejecting the recall power is because they saw these senators not as mere representatives of the states, but as national representatives as well, that are kind of partly representing the states. John Lansing, back to the anti-federalist side, said, it has been an argument urged with considerable zeal that if the state legislatures possessed the power of recall, its exercise would be governed by faction or caprice and subject to the impulses of the moment. And he's saying, like, look, okay, let's look at this argument and let's compare it to how it has played out under the Articles of Confederation. And he makes the case that didn't happen. He said, as far, therefore, as experience is satisfactory, we may safely conclude that none of these factious humors will operate to produce the evils which the gentlemen apprehend. And basically, he's basically saying that, the state governments have had this power of recall, but yet they've never exercised this power. Now, I've seen some discussion over some back and forth in New York and Massachusetts where there was an argument, I think it was more Massachusetts, where they're saying, well, no, actually, Rhode Island used this, but it wasn't this type of thing. The argument still went. It wasn't what people like Livingston were saying. It was just going to be based on faction and all kinds of turmoil. Now, on July 10th of 1788, this is in the New York Ratifying Convention, John Lansing again put forward another set of recommended amendments. They were basically saying, look, okay, let's make a deal. Like what Massachusetts did earlier in the year, we will do a kind of a conditional ratification, not really fully conditional, but we'll ratify, but we also want to include in there a bunch of recommended amendments. And so he put forward a whole series of them. And what was included in the ratification document by the state on July 26 was this recommended amendment, that no person be eligible as a senator for more than 6 years in any term of 12 years, similar to what Livingston had to say, right? And that the legislatures of the respective states may recall their senators or either of them and elect others in their stead to serve the remainder of the time for which the senators so recalled were appointed. So both Gilbert Livingston, John Lansing, Melancthon Smith, and a number of others were fully on board with this. They did get it. They had enough sway to get this included in the ratification document. It wasn't conditioned on that, but it was certainly considered quite important. Now, also in Rhode Island also recognized that even though maybe they were the only ones that ever had used a recall power in Congress, they recognized that the Constitution that they had refused to ratify for some time also did not have a recall power. So when they finally did ratify in May of 1790, they also recommended a bunch of proposed amendments. Number 18 is that the state legislatures have power to recall when they think it is expedient their federal senators and to send others in their stead. And then even in the years to follow, in 1807, there was actually an amendment proposal, I believe, in Congress. I'm not sure how far this went. Maybe some other students of history or people who are just interested in this stuff, people who geek out on it, would be able to know this a little bit better than me. If you do, please let me know in the comments. But James Barber wrote a letter to James Madison in December of 1807, saying this, I'd like to get your opinion upon another proposed amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which authorizes the state legislatures upon the concurrence of 2/3 to recall a senator. So there was no recall power. Everyone understood there was no recall power. This letter to James Madison is discussing a proposed amendment to have a recall power if 2/3 of the states agree, okay, you can go ahead and do this. James Madison never wrote back to say, oh, well, why are you doing this? Because we already have this power. That's already in the Constitution. I'm the father of the Constitution, and this already exists. So I'm not sure where this myth came from, but hopefully it's hard to prove a negative, but hopefully this information is pretty insightful and informative for you. Now, interestingly enough, George Mason in the Virginia Ratifying Convention had a few predictions about how things might play out under this system. This is back in June of 1788. He said the senators are chosen for 6 years. They are not recallable for those 6 years and are re-eligible at the end of the 6 years. It stands on a very different ground from the Confederation. In the new Constitution, instead of being elected for 1, they are chosen for 6 years. They cannot be recalled in that time for any misconduct, and at the end of that long term, may again be elected. And he goes on to make a kind of a prediction, rhetorical question here. What will be the operation of this? Is it not probable that those gentlemen who will be elected senators will fix themselves in the federal town and become citizens of that town more than of our state? And if you heard what Robert Livingston had to say in the New York Ratifying Convention, that really was the goal. He's saying, yeah, they represent the states, but really they're representatives of the Union. Now, George Mason wasn't a fan of that. He said, well, they will be more of a citizen of that town, the federal city, than that of our state. They will purchase a good seat in or near the town and become inhabitants of that place. They will be a continually existing body. They will exercise those machinations and contrivances which the many have always to fear from the few. I think that's a pretty good description of how things turned out. George Mason was a little bit onto something. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the anti-federalist arguments against the structure of the Senate, because if you're saying, okay, I don't like the 17th Amendment, let's just get rid of the 17th Amendment, the anti-federalists were opposed to the structure of the Senate even prior to popular election of senators. They didn't just want to have state legislatures appoint senators, and that's the end of the story. They also were concerned about a lack of a power recall. They predicted that it would turn into a permanent or baneful aristocracy, with senators mostly serving for life. I've got an episode on that that'll be linked to in the show notes, the Imperial Senate, Anti-Federalist Warnings. And then I also did one recently on the 17th Amendment, on how it changed what the Federalists described as the structure of the Constitution. 17th Amendment, did it destroy the structure of the Constitution? That'll also be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, we know the government-run schools really never teach any of this stuff. It's as if people just aren't capable of learning, according to government, or they just want to spoon feed us stuff that supports their own narrative of history and their own power. So we think it's absolutely essential to get this foundational historical information from the founders, the old revolutionaries, about the structure of the Constitution out to more and more people. And nothing helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And while I'm here, I want to take another quick moment and say a huge but quick thank you to a number of people who have joined us as members lately. I really appreciate your support. I couldn't be more grateful. There's Daryl in Alaska, Linda in Texas, Patrick in North Dakota, Jeffrey in Kansas, Robert in Florida, and Christina in Virginia. Again, I really appreciate all your support. If you also are able to afford it, I'd be very grateful to any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. One-time donation, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Do stuff for free to help us spread the word. Smash the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts, leave comments, subscribe, get notifications, smash the like button. All that stuff can help trigger algorithms, especially of the mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. Anyways, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. That's more important than anything. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.